something like a primate. So there are all these marsupials of Australia. Now, not all of them are there now because placental mammals came in with humans, and humans being placental mammals as well, and again, keeping the baby inside for a longer period of time instead of in a pouch where it might fall out or something when, you know, you're running away from a predator. They're out competing. In fact, not only do we see the pattern of the biogeography that marsupial mammals were the only mammals that were in Australia before any humans came with their placentas and their other placental mammals, but we are seeing what happened to marsupial mammals over time as the placental mammals took over on this other big hunk of land that was left and then split up, but after Australia broke off first. Kinda interesting. You can always look that up too if you want to know more about it. Both Darwin and Wallace studied island species, and one of the things they noticed was that the island species were different than the species on the nearby mainlands, but they were more alike to the species on the nearby mainland than the ones that were further away on the mainland. So they noticed that pattern, and again, that's what's really cool, and the name we give it now is adaptive radiation, like what happened with the finches. From one parental species of finch, there are whatever 13 or so species of finches. It's just so interesting what has happened with them. Okay. So pause. Ooh, I should have stopped. Oh well, I'll let the camera do it. And then there are examples that did not influence Darwin. They didn't influence Wallace because they're more recent. The peppered moths. I urge you to look up peppered moths and pre-industrial and post-industrial. And it's not a descent with modification as in there's a new species, but it is a change in allele frequencies in a population over time. So it's just really cool. And then what we see with bacteria and antibiotic resistance evolving. And as I had mentioned before, the change in allele frequencies, when you compare black Americans to black Africans, and that live in areas where malaria is still endemic. We had talked about that before. Okay, so there are other pieces of evidence supporting evolution. Oh, genetic sequencing or DNA sequencing. There's things, molecular technology, that also really supports evolution too, and again, post-Darwinian. But I want to talk about a few other things. So I want to talk about the factors that are necessary for natural selection to occur, because we're focusing right now on natural selection as one of the primary mechanisms of evolution. Then I want to mention the units of selection, and there were some questions about those. The one unit of evolution, the sources of variation, and types of selection. So, what is necessary for natural selection or selection to occur? Well, the characteristics must be passed down from parents to offspring. This wouldn't work if it wasn't something that the parent had that they passed on to their offspring, that they had, that they passed on to their offspring, and that they're doing better and more likely to survive and reproduce than other members of the population. But there has to be variation. Without variation, or, here we're going to go back to genetics, multiple alleles. If there's just one allele, no evolution is taking place because there's no change. There's 100% whatever the allele is, and unless there's a new mutation or some gene flow from another population somewhere, it's going to stay 100%. It's not going to change. Okay. Then there must be an excess of offspring produced, and that just sounds cruel, but, you know, 1 in 5 puppies doesn't make it to its first birthday. Think about grasshoppers and tadpoles and others. Fish. Oh, yeah, what do they say? An average of 2 salmon make it back for every breeding pair or something like that. It's just the way it is out there in the biological world. A lot of the offspring die. And differential reproductive success of those offspring must occur. So not only do they survive, see, we hear about survival of the fittest and how that's associated with natural selection, but it's not just survival of the fittest. Those survivors need to reproduce and pass those alleles that they have that are giving them some benefit on into the next generation. Okay, so that's the factors that are necessary for natural selection. Then the units of selection. And without giving you any background, I asked you what was the most likely unit of selection. And it was interesting to see what many of you wrote. Now you hopefully know that it's the individual, or you will. Well, and I wrote it down when I graded those weekly assignments. Okay, so we have 4 possibilities: gene, individual, kin, as in K-I-N, relatives, and group selection. So, gene selection. This was an idea of, what is his name? Richard Dawkins, that a gene could determine whether that organism survived or didn't. Thus, survived and reproduced or didn't. Okay? And there are not very many examples of this, because this would require a differential input of a single gene and its alleles on the survivability and the possibility of successful reproduction for that organism. So even though we're not quite sure they're living, but there might be some viruses or even some bacteria that we might be able to put a finger on gene selection as being more important for them. But as we get to more complex organisms, and again, even some of the bacteria have enough genes that are, it's the package, not the single gene, that's determining whether or not they survive and reproduce. Not and or, but reproduce, survive and reproduce. Then individual selection. So individual selection, and just think about it. Who survives and who reproduces? The individual. So that just right there, that should be it. Ooh, that is the most likely unit of selection. There was a time when people looked at what's called infanticide, and this is an ugly picture, and I'll try not to stay on this slide too long, but it's a male lion carrying a lion cub that he's killed. And they looked at this infanticide in these groups of animals and said, hey, that's group selection. They're killing the babies that they have less input in so far. So they're cutting their losses early because there's not enough food or there's some issue with the environment. And in order to save the older individuals that more time and energy input have gone into, they're killing the babies. And it sounded good. But then when people started looking at it, like with the lions, for example, this infanticide is indeed something that happens with lions, but it happens right after a takeover. Lions live in matrilineal groups, so they are related females. And the males that live with them, the adult males, come in from elsewhere, which is great because that allows for optimal outbreeding. So they're not their dads or their uncles. They're unrelated lions. So when a young lion, a young male lion, gets old enough, he's kicked out of that group. And the idea is that if he's big and bad enough, he'll go take over another group of lions. So right after a takeover, so the dominant male lion is killed or injured, and so he goes away to die or whatever. After that, the new lion, male lion, comes in. Well, there are babies, and those babies are not his, and he may not get to be the dominant male that has access to all those females for making his own babies. So he kills them. He kills the babies, the females go back into heat, he breeds with them, with the females, and they have his babies. And not only that, it goes even further than that. Females that have babies within a certain period of time after he takes over, he kills those babies too, because they're not his. So she'll go back into heat, he will breed with her, and the new babies will be his. So that's him and his individual fitness. Do you see? So he's surviving and he's reproducing, and he's not going to waste his time being able to reproduce and not reproducing because there's the previous male's offspring in the group. Kin selection makes sense as well, but you have to be able to recognize kin. So obviously we usually grow up with our relatives so we know who they are, but there are, you know, if you're a salamander, that might not be so easy. But anyway, if you help a relative with their offspring, you're still getting some what's called reproductive fitness out of it, because you share alleles with your relatives. And in fact, there have been researchers that have looked at it, and they see that it's more likely to happen in the yellow circle, where it's the offspring helping the parent, or full siblings helping each other. And then the further out you go and the less relationship, the less likely you are to see an individual giving up its own chance of having babies to help a relative. So it's really cool, and there are lots of examples like Belding's ground squirrels. Wasp are a good example. So there are lots of examples of kin selection. But again, you have to be able to recognize kin for this to work. And I did put here that because it's showing 100% relationship with a twin, that is only with an identical twin, not a fraternal twin. Fraternal twin has the same relationship as any other full sibling. And then that group selection, which is going to be kind of like gene selection, where we see it in some. We see it to a certain degree, but it's not the overwhelming selection. It's not the overwhelming unit of selection. But it does happen with some. I put a motorcycle group here, you know, Sons of Anarchy. But there are, in fact, humans are a little more group selected. There are people who have done amazing, heroic things to save other people's children. Like that guy in France that saw a kid hanging from a balcony of an apartment, like a 3rd or 4th or 5th floor. They called him Spider-Man, and the real-life Spider-Man. And this guy sees this kid hanging. He's just holding on to the railing, and he runs across the road, and he scaled that building, and he saved that child. Of course, about the time he got up there, the dad finally realized that his kid was hanging off the railing or something like that. You can look the story up. But, yeah. So, humans will sometimes put themselves at risk to save non-relatives, thus possibly losing their ability to raise their own offspring, which would put their alleles into the next generation. I would say that humans, before modern times, were probably quite group selected. The migratory humans would leave behind the older individuals because they would slow them down when they had to move. They would kill offspring that were not quote-unquote normal. Maybe they had a defect with legs or something like that, but they weren't going to be able to help with hunting, so they'd take them out and commit infanticide. So early humans were probably more group selected than we are now. But I want to draw a contrast. The units of selection, again, then that's natural selection. The possibilities are gene, individual, kin, and group, with individual being the most likely. But the unit of evolution is the population. And all we need to do is look back at that definition, the microevolution definition, a change in allele frequencies in a population over time. So it's the population that is changing, not the